Yemen is in the throes of the world's worst humanitarian crisis. The poorest Arab nation was already in dire straits, but a civil war that erupted in 2014 has made the situation even more grim. Now, international support to end the conflict is growing. That's because ordinary Yemenis desperately need help, caught in a conflict that has become a proxy war between regional powers Saudi Arabia and Iran. Also increasing pressure is the killing of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi, a hit that US intelligence believes was orchestrated by the Saudis. The killing shined a light on the US role in the war and its support for Saudi Arabia, which is leading a coalition battling Iranian-backed Houthi rebels. The task of bringing the war to a close will be filled with challenges. To understand them, it helps to look at Yemen's tangle of sectarian fault lines, its history of civil war, and the motivations of regional and world powers. Yemen sits at the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula, overlooking the vital shipping lanes of the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. The nation's history has been marked by colonization and dynastic rule. For decades, it was split between two nations, North and South. During the 1960s, war erupted. Spasms of civil war continued. By 1990, the North took over the South, forming a unified Yemen. Yemen's longtime autocratic ruler, President Ali Abdullah Saleh, once described the challenge of navigating Yemen's complicated tribal politics as dancing on the heads of snakes. Saleh was perhaps the trickiest player of all, manipulating allies and enemies alike. For years he took billions of dollars from the US to fight al-Qaeda, even as he enlisted the militants to fight his own domestic enemies. He was ousted in 2011 after a pro-democracy Arab Spring uprising, but the democracy that Yemenis had hoped for didn't materialize. The latest civil war began in 2014 when Saleh allied with the Houthis, and together they took over the capital Sana'a and much of the north and west. President Abdrabbuh Mansur Hadi fled to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia formed a coalition of Arab and Gulf states to push back the Houthis, who they believed were backed by Iran. The US and European countries have sold billions of dollars worth of weapons to the coalition. The Houthis, inspired by Iran's revolution, are fiercely anti-American and anti-Western, portraying themselves as defenders of Yemen's Zaidi Shiite minority. Iran denies supplying the rebels, but the US says it has evidence. Complicating the picture are militants, mainly al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, once called the terrorist organization's most dangerous branch. The US has long sought to strike at militant groups in Yemen, and its use of drones has dramatically grown in recent years. After the Khashoggi killing, the US has cut back on its logistical support to the Saudi coalition. The ensuing war has been devastating, with estimates of more than 60,000 people killed, millions driven from their homes, and vast destruction to the infrastructure from coalition bombing. It has also pushed Yemen into near famine, with millions at risk of starving to death. The AP's reporting over the past year uncovered new dimensions to the tragedy. Mothers and fathers are giving up food so they can dedicate what little they do have to keeping their starving children alive. Coalition member United Arab Emirates has set up a network of secret prisons all around the south where torture is rampant, including sexual abuse. After AP's reporting, dozens of prisoners were released. Torture is also rife in the prisons of the Houthi rebels, who have jailed thousands in crackdowns aimed at eliminating any dissent, or just aimed at collecting captives that they can use to trade for ransom or their own captured fighters. As the UN and the international community push for an end to the conflict, it remains to be seen whether a peaceful, unified Yemen is possible. Houthis don't want to return to how it was before the latest war, and the country is more fragmented than ever. Coalition-backed militias that control parts of the south don't necessarily support Hadi. Some in the south want to secede. Militants feel emboldened. Even if the war ends soon, Yemen will struggle with its legacy for years to come.
In this video, I'm going to be explaining the Yemen-Saudi conflict in a generalized but chronological, simple explanation that is often mischaracterized and outright falsely reported by the US legacy media. A war that started under the Obama administration, which carried over into the Trump administration, which unfortunately is now carried over to the Biden administration, making this the single largest humanitarian crisis in the world today. Yet the media will have you believe that the conflict in Ukraine far precedes the conflict in Yemen, even though both conflicts have the tentacles of the United States federal government. The conflict started as a result of the Yemeni civil war, which started in 2014. The civil war began in September of 2014 when Houthi forces took over the capital city of Sana'a, which was followed by a rapid Houthi takeover of the government, in which on March 21st, 2015, the Houthi-led Supreme Revolutionary Committee declared a general mobilization to overthrow Abdrabbuh Mansur Hadi and expand their control by driving into the southern provinces. But you're asking yourself, what are the Houthis? The Houthi movement is an Islamic armed movement that emerged from Sada in North Yemen during the 1990s. They are predominantly a Zayd Shia force, where the leadership is drawn largely from the Houthi tribe. The Houthis have a complex relationship with the Sunni Muslims in Yemen, in which the movement had discriminated previously against Sunnis, but also recruited and allied with them in previous conflicts. BBC and United Nations High Commission for Refugees, as well as the Wilson Center, have reported on this history, questionable history, further. Under the leadership of Hussein Bedreddin al-Houthi, the group emerged as an opposition to the former Yemen president, Ali Abdul Saleh, whom they charged with financial corruption and criticized for being backed by Saudi Arabia and the United States at the expense of the Yemeni people and their sovereignty. The civil war had the Houthi forces currently controlling the capital of Sana'a and all of North Yemen except Maghrib Governorate. They had clashed with the Saudi-backed pro-government forces loyal to Hadi. And since the formation of the Southern Transitional Council in 2017 and the subsequent capture of the port of Aden by the Southern Transitional Council, the anti-Houthi coalition had been fractured with regular clashes between pro-Hadi forces backed by Saudi Arabia and the Southern separatists backed by the United Arab Emirates. There is a history between Ali Abdul Saleh al-Admar and the United States. And to give you a general description, Saleh, who was a Yemeni politician who served as the first president of Yemen from 1990 to his resignation in February 2012, following this revolution. He has developed deeper ties with Western powers, especially the United States, in the war on terror, Islamic terrorism, and may have been used and encouraged by Ali Abdul Saleh to win Western support for disruptive, politically motivated attacks. But in 2011, in the wake of the Arab Spring, which spread across North Africa and the Middle East, Saleh's time in office became more and more untenable until he was ousted as president in 2012. He was succeeded by Abdrabbuh Mansur Hadi, who had been vice president since 1994. Hadi had then taken up his position and solidified ties with the United States. Hadi was seen as a pragmatist, but he had much in the way of political reform, including a strong tie with U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry under the Obama administration. Hadi had pushed for delegates at the conference, at the National Dialogue Conference in 2013, to break a deadlock on key issues and bring back the talks to an overdue close. The attendants agreed on few points and launched into an impassioned speech, which led to his popularity. The conference concentrated on Yemen, which would shift to a federal model of government in the future, a move which had been proposed and forcefully backed by Hadi. For many years, Yemenis, particularly in northwestern Yemen, have been decentralized and was less attractive to everybody around the world. However, he was not a man of the people. This led to growing resentment toward Abdrabbuh. The Saudi government intervened. Meanwhile, as they continually bombed the country, especially in North Yemen, this led to many thousands being killed. Meanwhile, the United States started pouring in millions of dollars under the Obama administration. Obama even authorized for the Saudi government to be supplied with US American-made weapons. This led to unprecedented amount of deaths, and the Obama administration found another failure of magnificent proportions, which would far outweigh his failure in Libya. According to Human Rights Watch article dated November 19, 2018, the Obama administration officials issued a statement calling on the Trump administration to end all support for Saudi Arabia in the war on Yemen. However, this conflict was predicated on Obama giving Saudi Arabia the support it needed for the conflict in Yemen. The article would also state that a more honest reckoning for how the U.S. got to where it is in this war in Yemen would start with a greater admission of the truth of the Obama administration's motivations and mistakes in participating in this war. The Obama administration started justifications for joining the war effort, obscure the truth of what then led to the war. Other Obama administration officials had already stated that their support for the war, coupled with $1 billion arms deals, was first and foremost payback for Saudi's grudging tolerance of the Iran nuclear deal, and to reassure them that the U.S. remained a reliable ally despite the deal. The amount of Iranian support to the Houthis have been debated, of course, but with little evidence. However, the United States and Israel, as well as the Gulf, led by Saudi Arabia, had long been antagonizing Iran that far predates even all the conflicts in the Middle East. For years, dating back to Menachem Begin, all the way through to Benjamin Netanyahu, to the current administration under Israel, Iran had been seen as the primary enemy in the region, using the United States military to defeat their preconceived enemies in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya. Israel continues to be a thorn in Iran's side. On March 26, 2015, Saudi Arabia, leading a coalition of 9 countries from West Asia and North Africa, launched an intervention in the Yemeni civil war in response to calls for the president, Abdrabbuh Mansur Hadi, who called for military support after he was ousted by the Houthi movement. the conflict ignited between the government forces, in which the Houthi rebels and other armed groups, after the draft resolution and power sharing agreements collapsed, despite progress in the political transition led by the United Nations at that time, leading to an escalation of violence in 2014, which led to the current conflict. Codenamed Operation Decisive Storm, the intervention initially consisted of a bombing campaign on Houthi rebels and later a naval blockade and the deployment of ground forces into Yemen. The Saudi-led coalition has attacked the positions of the Houthi militia and loyalists of the former president of Yemen, Ali Abdullah Saleh, which was supported by Iran. The coalition comprised of Egypt, Morocco, Jordan, Sudan, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain. They all took part in the operation. The United States provided intelligence and logistical support, including aerial refueling and search and rescue to downed coalition pilots. It also accelerated the safe passage of weapons to coalition staters and continued strikes against al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. In January 2016, the Saudi foreign minister said that the United States and British military officials were in the command and control center responsible for the Saudi-led airstrikes in Yemen, having access to lists of targets, but were not involved in choosing those targets. This is backed by reports by The Guardian dated January 2016, headlined British and US military in command room for Saudi strikes in Yemen, in which the article also states that, quote, British and American military officials are in the command and control center for Saudi airstrikes on Yemen and have access to lists of targets. Human rights groups, the European Parliament, and the United Nations have all expressed concerns about airstrikes by a Saudi-led coalition in Yemen in support of the internationally recognized government. Nearly 3,000 civilians have been killed at this point, and since a full-blown civil war broke out in March, according to the United Nations, 1 million other people have been displaced, and the country is now at serious risk of famine, end quote. That article was dated January 15th of 2016. Those numbers have risen exponentially. However, the war received widespread criticism and had a dramatic worsening effect on Yemen's humanitarian situation that reached the level of a humanitarian disaster or catastrophe. The question of whether or not the intervention is in compliance with Article 2 of the UN Charter has been the matter of academic dispute. On March 29, 2022, the Saudi-led coalition announced that it would cease all hostilities within Yemen starting at 6 a.m. the following day in order to facilitate political talks and peacekeeping efforts. However, according to an article by the Human Rights Watch and other articles alone, this is basically the United States trying to save face in a war that is actually facilitated by the United States and Great Britain. The United States has deep ties with Saudi Arabia that go back to 1932, when the American oil company Standard Oil found the oil reserves south of the country. Ever since then, the United States, which has no type of affiliations with the culture or the religion of the country, stood by as an ally for the next 90 years, even though the country itself gave birth to the ideology of Wahhabism, which gave the world such terrorist groups like al-Qaeda, the Islamic State. As-Sahab media is the media arm which propagated other groups like Boko Haram, Jaish-e-Mohammed, and other Salafi-oriented groups which committed acts of terrorism, in which the Saudi Arabian government throughout the 1980s and 90s gave hush money to these groups so that they would not be attacked because of the United States military presence in two of the most holiest sites of Islam, Mecca and Medina. Incidentally, these Salafist groups see the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia as heretical to the religion of Islam. However, the Wahhabi-led oriented groups are anti-ethical to the religion itself, which is quite ironic. The conflict has seen quite a worrying number of those killed, which now has reached to 500,000 and has displaced more than 1.4 million people from the country, all predicated on the United States sending billions of dollars in aid to a country that gave us these terrorist groups, that facilitated and took part in the attacks of the United States on September 11, 2001, that murdered a US journalist in Jamal Khashoggi, that has given us beheadings at Riyadh Square to scientists, engineers, secularists, and those who are outspoken to the brutal monarchy. Why does the United States continue to be allied with a country that has a disparaging and abhorrent human rights record? One could say the same for even Israel. But for now, the largest humanitarian crisis in the world, in Yemen, continues to be ignored. And those of the left, those who claim to be libertarians, those who claim to be liberals, people who care about human rights of others, continue to ignore what is happening in Yemen, but wear proudly the flag of the Ukrainian people in their bios and in their profiles online. These are the hypocrites who have supported the left establishment of Obama and Biden, who have facilitated the largest humanitarian crisis in Yemen.